This is Cold Start.
We told you all about the GT1 cars that went flying in the late 90s and how Mercedes entered and then quickly exited the endurance racing space. You know, there's a whole history here, and it's kind of at odds with what we think of Mercedes-Benz today. You know, we're kind of surprised they haven't had success in this particular venue given their domination in Formula One and road course, GT3 racing, and this whole history. They were the preeminent race team to be involved with. But it turns out Mercedes has been cursed. They have a hex on them or something, right? Every time they've come to the 24-hour of Le Mans, the biggest race event in the world, they've been not just not successful, it's been spectacularly catastrophic. And we want to dig deeper into this. Like, what is it with Mercedes and Le Mans that continues to stymie them, continues to present these obstacles to the most important race for them to win, for their reputation, for their brand? And the things that have gone wrong there have gone spectacularly wrong.
Yeah, it's really interesting because, we think about Mercedes and they're one of those big companies within motorsports, whether that's BMW, Ferrari, or some of those other bigger German manufacturers. Mercedes is amongst that list. And, cars like the 190E that we herald as an incredible touring car, DTM car, the race cars of the 80s and the 90s. So Whenever we think about Mercedes and even F1 nowadays, when we think about Mercedes, we think about a motorsport brand, a motorsport car brand. And it's interesting that this race, this very prominent endurance race, the 24 Hours of Le Mans, arguably the largest race in Europe, that Mercedes doesn't have this huge pedigree. I mean, Porsche has a massive pedigree at Le Mans and stuff like that. So you think that Mercedes would be there to compete and try to go after it. And we talked a little bit about Mercedes at Le Mans in our GT1 episode. Nothing good, right?
Yeah.
They took it a little bit too seriously. They wanted to win the 24 Hours of Le Mans, took it a bit too far. Car started going through the air. What's crazy is that's not the first time that they had a bad time at Le Mans. And it was actually a long time before those GT1 cars that they even did Le Mans. There was a massive gap that they just completely disappeared from the space. So I think it might be worthwhile to go back in times of history and look at what is this flight path, no pun intended, of Mercedes in endurance racing and what happened.
It seems like it keeps coming around. This one race, the 24 Hour of Le Mans, just is so elusive to Mercedes, the brand. And when you look at this race, Porsche has the record for the most overall wins at the 24 Hour of Le Mans. I think a lot of people just associate Porsche and the 24 Hour of Le Mans together. Then, of course, Audi had that run where they were completely dominant going into the 2000s era with their diesel. Ferrari has, of course, been historically really successful there. And then going back way in history, you have Jaguar and Bentley. And then more recently, Toyota's been pretty dominant. The name Mercedes is absent here. I mean, I'm getting into Alfa Romeo and Ford, Matra Simca, and Peugeot. All these teams, all these manufacturers have more success at Le Mans than Mercedes-Benz? How is this possible?
They didn't go that many times. Mercedes, for a couple instances, took kind of a hiatus from the race because of bad things happening. And once again, we'll get into the disaster of the 1955 24 Hours of Le Mans race, and we'll do a deep dive into that incident and what happened and what caused a country to completely ban motorsports altogether, as well as Mercedes not returning for a couple of decades. But we'll start at the beginning, right? When was the first time that Mercedes actually went to a 24 Hours of Le Mans?
It was actually in 1930. So 1923 was the first running of the 24 Hour of Le Mans. 1930 was the 8th instance of this. To give you some idea of where we were in history, 1930 was the middle of, maybe the lowest point, the nadir of the Great Depression, right? Wall Street had crashed, finances tanked, the value of the dollar went way down. People are having a hard time finding jobs. There were food lines. There were people trying to just do anything that they could to survive. And amongst all of this, still in the world going on is motor racing, of course. And the Mercedes-Benz team entered for the first time ever in 1930 with their 7.1-liter supercharged SSK. The SSK stood for Super Sport Kurz. Kurz is German for short, so it was a short wheelbase car. And it was entered by Rudolf Caracciola and Christian Werner. They were one of only 33 cars that entered in this race. So if you think about Le Mans today, we're We're talking like 60, 80 cars across multiple classes all racing the same course at the same time. Only 33 cars entered this race. And because of the Depression, only 19 of those 33 actually made it to the race, right? They were having so many financial problems and supply problems that they just couldn't muster a proper entry to the 24 Hour of Le Mans. In 1930, they ran with 3 classes. There was a small class, which were engines smaller than 1 liter. Kind of hard to get your head around today. Like, what cars would be competing in the 24 Hour of Le Mans with engines smaller than 1 liter? But that was a class. The medium class was 1 to 2 liter, and then the large class were engines that were larger than 2 liters. So obviously, the 7.1 liter supercharged Mercedes fell into the large category. And their primary competitors were teams like Bentley and Alfa Romeo. Bentley had their Speed 6. Bugatti, MG. This is the era we're talking about, right? Really early in racing. This car, let me tell you more about the Mercedes. It was a 6-cylinder, 7.1 liter car. It was good for about 170 horsepower in its normal trim. But for this race, they affixed a supercharger, a Roots supercharger, that brought the power of this car from 170 to about 300 horsepower. 1930, 300 horsepower.
I feel like that's pretty impressive.
Yeah, that's crazy impressive. And get this, over 500 foot-pounds of torque.
And Mercedes has always been known for their torques, especially the AMG. So it's funny to see, even in the early days, the 1930s, the numbers go in that direction.
Super torquey.
Now, this era, 1930s, like, we have to think about these cars because I think it's hard for me to like conceptualize what a 1930s race car looks like.
Yeah.
They don't look specialized to racing. I mean, they're open cockpit, essentially convertibles, roadsters, right? Is
Yeah.
I think the sportier term that we can call them. But I can't imagine there's seatbelts or a roll cage or that much in regards to safety. It's kind of, cruising around for 24 hours. But these cars were still decently fast, maybe?
Yeah, they were fast. They were open top. They had these big rounded fenders and a giant grille up front. It looked like an old roadster from the 30s, and they just kitted it out for racing. It doesn't really look like a race car. It's kind of hard to believe that this is what they called a race machine at the time. It was considered the fastest car of its day. They were able to get up to about 125 miles an hour in this thing. So again, 1930, 125 miles an hour, way outpacing any horse that they were going to be on.
Yeah, I think decently impressive for the time. Now, with this car that we have in the 1930s, first time Mercedes-Benz comes to the 24 Hours of Le Mans, how'd they do?
So the car entered. They went into the race against the Alphas and the Bentleys. They fared pretty well for a while until they ran into a mechanical failure. It was a DNF as a result of, and this is a little history lesson for you too, a broken dynamo. Can you point to the part of your car today that is a dynamo?
No idea.
No, it's effectively the generation part of the engine, right? But they called it the dynamo, and they had some battery problems, and so they weren't able to finish the race.
So 1930, that was the first time Mercedes entered. They DNF'd at some point during the night. They didn't even finish the race the first time that they entered the 24 Hours of Le Mans. Now, the next time that Mercedes comes back to this race is a while later. Now, there are many things that were happening in the world between the 30s and the 50s, especially in Europe primarily. So it wasn't until 1952 that Mercedes made its return as a company back to the 24 Hours of Le Mans. So this was post-war. A lot of things were going on in Germany, of course, being able to reestablish themselves. It took them until 1952 to finally bring the team back to Le Mans.
Yeah, history is really important here, and we have to consider the circumstances in the world when these things were happening, right? 1930, Great Depression, that was after World War I, but before World War II, and we know how that all went, right? So that brings us into 1952, where Mercedes enters the 24 Hour of Le Mans again, 32 years after their prior entry, with now the W194 300 SL Gullwing. So if you know that car, it's iconic in the history of cars. The Gullwing. It's a 3-liter S6 engine. The car that they raced in the 1952 24 Hour of Le Mans, Mercedes, was actually less powerful than the road-going version of the 300 SL they sold 2 years later. So that just gives you some idea where this was. And their competitors at the time were Aston Martin, Jaguar, Ferrari, and a new entry, Porsche. So by then, Ferdinand Porsche had split off from Mercedes and started his own little entity that started building its own cars. Going into the 1952 Le Mans, Mercedes had a lot better organization, a lot better car, a lot better reliability. Again, don't forget where we are in the world here. This is a post-war period where Germany is still rebuilding. This is a place where the factories that these companies, Mercedes and so forth, had were leveled. They were bombed to the ground, right? There was rubble on the ground in these cities. And yet they're somehow 6 years after the war, not even able to muster an entry into this race. So it was considered this thing. It was like a country, a nationalistic pride thing where Germans were going through a really difficult period, right? There was the whole Nazi movement and things that happened there. And there were people who weren't supporters of that, but happened to live in the country at the time. And right. So there was this big identity crisis for German people. Their country was occupied by much of the rest of Western Europe. And yet, even still among all of this stuff, Mercedes was able to muster an entry into the 24 Hours of Le Mans after that long absence.
And the 24 Hours of Le Mans, like that is a massive European stage. There's other countries coming there, whether it's the Italians, the British, they're coming there to compete. It's kind of, in a way, I'm not going to say a World Cup like soccer, but like in a sense, right? The 24 Hours of Le Mans brings so many different countries, so many different teams.
Yes.
And for Mercedes to come post-war, bringing an entry, and if they do well in the 1952 race, that kind of waves the flag for Germany a little bit.
Yeah, they were coming out of this period where like they felt bad about all these things that happened.
Right.
For good reason, to a large extent, but like not everybody who was involved with that, if you know what I'm saying.
Yeah.
So they were able to kind of have some pride on behalf of what they could do as a country, on behalf of this turning point in their country's history, where they were now going to be approaching things in a different way. They've sort of accepted this past thing, these horrible things that occurred, and now we're trying to turn a new leaf and focus forward. And motorsports, auto racing was a way to do that, right? People were trying to rally around something that was constructive and positive. And so one of the drivers in the 52 Le Mans series was driving a French entry, the Talbot Lago car, the T26. There's a guy named Pierre Levet, and I need to call him out because he wasn't the Mercedes driver in 52, but he attempted something that seems nearly impossible and pretty insane by current standards. He attempted to drive the 24 Hour of Le Mans entirely by himself. Let me just restate that. Pierre Levet drove for 23 hours of the 24 Hour of Le Mans alone. He refused to let his co-driver take over because he felt like the car had sort of a sensitivity or a vulnerability that it might actually fail, but only he was in a position that he could nurse the car home throughout the race. And he made it to hour 23 with just over an hour of the race left, where he broke a connecting rod or a crankshaft bearing, depending on the report, and he DNF'd. And then later there were reports that like the guy must have been just like at the end of his wits. I mean, 23 hours in a race car.
I can't even imagine
how fatigued you must be. He probably just money shifted or missed a shift or something and like damaged the engine in the end. It's a controversy that still exists to today. But the thing to recognize from that is that's the level of commitment. That's the level of dedication and persistence and follow through people had here. And again, following World War II, they took this motorsports thing really seriously because it was a proxy form of competition for them to get out there and try to represent their country. And here's Pierre Levet, Frenchman, driving a French car in the world heralded famous French race, the 24 Hour of Le Mans in 1952.
So 52, back to Mercedes. Mercedes did a phenomenal job. They came with their 300 SL, the Gullwing, as we all know it nowadays, an awesome car. And in 52, they put it on top. They finished 1-2. So Mercedes ended up winning the 24 Hours of Le Mans overall with one of essentially their first entries. I mean, they raced in 1930.
Yeah.
Didn't go really well.
No.
They disappeared for a long time. They came back in 52 and dominated.
Yeah, and they won the thing, right? So you feel like, all right, this team came in, they showed what they were about, and they were able to actually take the victory. Well, what would happen in 1953, do you think?
They have to come back, right?
Right, yeah. They're going to come back and do more? No. In 1953 and 1954, Mercedes-Benz skipped the 24 Hour of Le Mans. This is coming off of their win at the 24 Hour Le Mans after having been so unsuccessful their first time around, after having been through all of World War II, rebuilding and coming back to the race, and they won, and then they just skipped out for a couple of years because they wanted to focus more on their development of their Formula One cars, as well as a new category of cars that they were starting to develop that were considered aero cars for GT racing.
Yeah, and so Mercedes was still racing in 53 and 54. Like you said,
Yes.
F1 as well as some road course racing, some other of the other
Sports
famous sports car races that were going on.
That's right.
And so they were continuing to develop the SL, creating more aero bodywork, stuff like that. Like Mercedes was still prominent within motorsports. For whatever reason, they just decided to skip the 24 Hours of Le Mans for 2 years, for 1953, 1954, and then they came back in 55 to try to hold on to their reputation of winning at Le Mans.
Yeah, and by now they had developed that 300 SL Gullwing into the 300 SLR. This is the W196S for all those Mercedes geeks. This car was derived from the F1 W196 car, the 300 SL, and had been evolved further. So this is what you think of as the Stirling Moss SLR that they then came up with a recreation later in the 2000s. This was that car, the 722 car. So 1955, June 11th, that's the 24 Hour of Le Mans. We were talking all about World War II and the sort of representation on behalf of countries, and this was really seen as a way to represent not only your nation, but the sportsmanship of different nations coming together to compete. And the Mercedes team was sort of leaning into this. They kind of took the approach that they would be diplomatic, that they would have multiple nationalities on their team, not just representing Germany anymore, but they would have a Frenchman, they would have an Italian, they would have an Argentine. They have all these different people driving on their team. And it was a way to sort of represent that all nations kind of thing of the closeness of all the countries in Europe. And after World War II had happened, it was seen as a real diplomatic gesture. And consider that the Mercedes-Benz factories were being rebuilt from rubble. All the while, the strongest car industry in all of Europe at the time was happening in the UK. So this sort of head-to-head battle between the Brits and the Germans that had occurred in World War II is now sort of transitioning itself somewhat over into the racetrack. Even though Mercedes was trying to make this sort of diplomatic move forward with all the nationalities on their team, there was still that sort of backdrop going on. And, Le Mans, think about what the 24 Hour of Le Mans is. It's this party atmosphere of like well-dressed people. Over 300,000 people attended the 24 Hour of Le Mans in 1955, right? This has been a huge race for the entire history of it going on. And the drivers who were there, they were seen as like daredevil heroes, driving for 24 hours and these treacherous conditions and the endurance that it required, the stamina, just like how much of a man were you if you could actually pull off this feat? It was seen to be this really high accomplishment. And these drivers were revered. And Pierre Levet, who he drove 23 hours in 1952, the French driver who was so revered, entered the 24 Hour of Le Mans in France as part of the Mercedes-Benz team this time around.
And it seemed like going into 1955, a lot of people were talking about Mercedes-Benz as the team to beat, the team to be on, that they were, whether that was their success with their Formula One program or their other sports car racing that they were doing, people saw them as a legitimate threat coming back to the race in 1955. And so there was a lot of excitement behind those cars. And I believe they had 3 entrants, so they brought 3 SLRs to compete in the 24 Hours of Le Mans. And there's a lot of eyes on them to be competitive, to go out there and to dominate once again like they did in 1952. I mean, at this point, they have a pretty good track record, a pretty good batting average for their success at Le Mans in regards to their entrance. And like you said, it was pretty neat that they had this diversity on the team. There was not just Germans, right?
That's right.
There was a nice mixture. Now, there was the preferred team, right? And in all racing, there's always the number 1 car, the number 2,
car,
and the backup, right? So maybe they had their main guys on that lead car, but, they had pretty good odds. 3 cars in the race. Everyone's looking at them to be competitive. Things are looking good for Mercedes in 1955.
Yeah, and it was a full field. Now, we talked about 1930 not being able to muster many cars out there. In the 1955 Le Mans, we had 87 cars registered for just 60 places. So there was a competition to qualify to be in this race. Again, we ran with multiple classes, and there were pretty major speed deltas among those classes. That's something important to keep in mind. The differences in speed during a race or with cars next to each other tends to create some tricky circumstances. So we'll watch that space for it. Let's talk about the car for a minute. This is the 300 SLR, right? That very famous roadster style. This is effectively a Grand Prix car, but it's got a sports car body, right? It looks like a sports car. It doesn't look like a Formula One car the way we think of them today, certainly at all, and even at the time. The body shape was really innovative at the time due to the space frame chassis approach that they took, which was novel at the time. They had these interlocking struts in this special geometric pattern to create their body and their frame, and they used magnesium panels. They were strong but light. The car was a 3-liter, 8-cylinder with about 310 horsepower, which again, was pretty small compared to a lot of the other cars, but made up for it given the aerodynamics and the much lighter weight of that car. Something else interesting to know is about technical innovations. All the way back in 1955, the Mercedes-Benz 300 SLR, this car, and the precursor, the 300 SL Gullwing, they were fuel injected. They weren't carbureted cars. It was an early mechanical form of fuel injection. And they also used this valve actuation called desmodromic valve actuation, which is a way to replace conventional valve springs, which would create this like floating condition at high RPM. So these were all things that were new to this car, and they kind of pushed the envelope forward in technology. And I mean, fuel injection, there were cars in the 70s and 80s that were only getting fuel injection then. So this was really ahead of its time. And that car, what was up against was the Jaguar. That was their primary competitor, the Jaguar D-Type. It was a lot less powerful than the Mercedes. It was maybe about 280, 290 horsepower. And just to give you an idea of the comparison, Mercedes-Benz was like firing up their factory again. They were building cars, they were entering racing. They had effectively this giant army of people working on the newly rebirthed Mercedes-Benz. Back in Coventry, England, in the UK, where Jaguar was based, they had all of 14 people engineering these cars. That was their entire team. So by comparison, for Jaguar to even be able to muster competition with Mercedes-Benz, that just gives you some idea about the approach at the time. And their driver, the Jaguar's driver, was a guy named Mike Hawthorne. He was really well known and very popular. He was sort of like a young, well-to-do, wealthy playboy type, like blonde dude, just like the guy you'd picture kind of sitting on the beach in the 50s. And the French fans all called him Le Papillon, which means the butterfly, because he wore a bow tie while he drove. And he's up against the Mercedes cars. So 3 entries, one driven by Juan Manuel Fangio and Sir Sterling Moss.
Great names in motorsport.
I mean, that's probably the strongest 1-2 lineup of a car maybe that's ever been driven. I mean, when you consider the accomplishments of those 2 individual drivers, they were the number 1 car. The number 2 car was driven by the Frenchman, Pierre Levet, and an American, John Fitch, who had been experienced race driver up until this point, but it was a real interesting development now to have an American driving on this, the German team, post-World War II. Again, we're bringing all these nationalities together in a way that was sort of unexpected at the time. The 3rd Mercedes car was driven by no names now, like nobody talks about Carl Kling or Andre Simon, so we won't talk about them anymore either.
So to kind of paint the picture a little bit more, so we have the cars, which are phenomenal, the driver lineup, car 1, car 2 at least seem pretty stacked, and the competition of these other cars that are going to be competing. Now, to put in perspective, in the 1950s and 1955, some of these cars on track are reaching speeds over 180 miles an hour.
Yeah.
Now, by modern day standards, that's fast.
180.
And if we consider what these cars looked like back then, what the tire technology was back then, what the brake technology was back then, 180 is going to feel a lot faster in the 1950s than it does in 2025. I can tell you that for sure.
And no roll cages, and no seat belts, and no onboard fire extinguishers, and barely even radios to radio into the pit to say there's a problem, I need help with this thing, right? So it's just the mindset of these drivers at the time was just different. The racetrack itself was different. You think about the Circuit de la Sarthe. That's what they call the road course where they run this 24-hour Le Mans every year. And it's an open to the public road when they're not running the race. And you got to keep that in mind. But the track was a lot different then. They have since slowed the track down considerably to increase safety. The things that we think about that are so distinctive about the Circuit de la Sarthe today, the Porsche curves, the Ford chicane, the S's, none of those existed. None of those were part of the racetrack when this was running in 1955. It was a lot straighter, a lot faster, and a lot more of a tricky course, to the point where in the Mercedes driven by Fangio, he was able to hit an eventual top speed of 181 miles an hour. And they had not modified the safety, the runoffs, the barriers, the grandstands, any part of the racetrack since cars were topping out at 55 miles per hour when they started running this race.
And the track itself is essentially just racing through the French countryside. That's kind of what it always was, of just racing through, a public road, a 2-lane public road with trees lining it on the left and the right. You could, as a spectator, be kind of positioned wherever you want right?
Yeah.
There's not a lot of limitations. There's not a lot of restrictions. There's not a lot of safety for spectators. It's just kind of, there's a race going on, post up in a picnic, and enjoy watching the cars go by.
Between the main straight and the grandstands, there was an earthen and hay barrier.
What is earthen?
Earthen, made out of dirt and mud, like adobe, but not that strong. Okay, so it was like literally dirt piled up on a bunch of hay bales along the side of the grandstands, and a white picket fence, for a little style.
Yeah, for the aesthetic, right?
Well, again, it was this well-dressed group of people coming out for a party out in the French countryside. People were drinking wine and champagne in the stands.
It's a major event. People are there to enjoy themselves. And so 1955 is known as the disaster of Le Mans. And I think you guys can see the picture we're starting to paint here of these cars, the speeds they're going, the limited safety features, the speed differentials in the different performances of the vehicles, all these sorts of things that might potentially lead to a sticky situation.
So let's lead up to the beginning of this race. All the fanfare, the stands are packed, 300,000 revelers are there partying, drinking wine and champagne in the stands. They're getting ready to bring the racers out. They were doing this thing still at the time that they called the Le Mans start. And if you've ever watched a race, right, there's kind of like two ways we see races start today. There's standing start where everybody's stopped in a position on the grid and then the lights go off and they all start to drive. Or there's a rolling start where they kind of come around in formation, driving together at a certain fixed speed, and then the green light goes and everybody takes off. Well, this was a third way that they invented, which was a new way of starting races. I guess it wasn't new, it was really old, called the Le Mans start. What they would do is they would line up all of the vehicles along pit road on an angle, like on a 45-degree angle parked up against the wall. And the drivers would be all the way across pit road from their cars. So the cars are on one side and the drivers are on the other. They'd fire the starter's pistol, and the drivers would run across pit lane, jump in their car, and go. And belt in? Meh, maybe.
You could figure it out on a straightaway.
If there was any belt to put on. I mean, it was literally part of the race was running to your car, just out of control. And interestingly enough, Fangio, who was an older guy by this time, he's 43 years old, and was known for being a little paunchy. He didn't look like an athlete. He looked like, he had been enjoying his life a little bit. So he runs/waddles over to his car, gets in, and all of a sudden, the Mercedes is just sitting there, and all the other cars are pulling out, and the Jaguar is long gone, and the other Mercedes are going, and Fangio's just sitting in the pits, and they couldn't figure out what's going on. Well, it turned out his trousers, his pants, got stuck on the gear shift lever when he got in the car. Literally, his pants got caught around the gear shift knob. So he had to undo that before he could get the car rolling out of pit lane. So that delayed the guy. I mean, that's kind of funny.
Oh, yeah.
But at the same time, you're like, what? What was the contraption he was getting into? His pants got caught around the gear shift? What is this?
And the Fangio Sterling Moss car, that was the favorite car of the Mercedes team to win the overall race. That was the main car. All the other cars were going to work as a team to make sure that car could win. And now here's Team Mercedes watching their star players not even getting to a good start for the 24-hour.
Yeah, the race is underway, and here's the leader in the world and the leading car, and they're not even out of pit lane yet while everybody's already taking off. So just crazy. And, Jaguar and Porsche and the others, they knew that they were outclassed by Mercedes. Mercedes came in 52. They were dominant. They left, and they've been busy in F1, and they're back again, and what should we expect, right? They're hungry for it. They want to win again. So they knew that this was kind of where they were, and so Jaguar had to develop a strategy because they were pretty clear that their car was outclassed by the 300 SLR. When Mike Hawthorne was getting ready to race, he decided that the way he'd go about this was to try to run Fangio, who's starting out in the Mercedes car, long, to try to go beyond the endurance capability of the Mercedes, to basically run it as hard as he could for as long as he could to see if they can get the car to fail, like an outright sprint from the beginning of the race, rather than preserving his car or trying to maintain his tires or anything. His goal was for Fangio to have to chase him as fast as possible and to run past the ability of his car to actually cause it to fail. So we're coming up on about 2 hours into the race. Mike Hawthorne has already broken the lap record at this point in the Jaguar, and he's been now trading the lead with Fangio. So Fangio and Mike Hawthorne are now really battling it out, scrapping out between first and second place. They'd go into a turn, Fangio would take the lead. They'd come out of that turn into the next turn, Mike Hawthorne would take the lead. 2.5 hours into the race, Hawthorne leads, Fangio second. Levet, by now, is almost a whole lap down, but is in third place in the second Mercedes. Approaching this time, they're coming up on the first pit stop window. So you can imagine during a 24-hour race, we have to refuel, we need new tires, we have to top off fluids, drivers need a break, all that kind of stuff. So right around lap 35 was the first pit stop window planned for this race. And at this point, Mike Hawthorne in the Jaguar D-Type is leading Fangio, and he's about to lap Pierre Levet. So Pierre Levet is in third in the second Mercedes, but is already a whole lap down. And here's Fangio coming around, getting ready to lap him already. Then in addition is Lance Macklin driving the Austin Healey, which is a lot slower car in a different class, and he's coming down the straight at the same time. Well, Mike Hawthorne coming in the Jag, he gets a late signal to come into the pits, right? This being that opening of the pit window. And so he braked really sharply right in front of the Austin Healey that was being driven by Lance Macklin. And there's a lot of controversy about what happened here in what order, but there's been a series of photographs that have been sequenced in an animation form over time that were taken from archives that made this really clear that it was the Macklin car that crossed in front of Hawthorne's Jag that caused this issue. Macklin braked really hard and veered to the side into the dirt. Once he went off into the dirt, again, no barriers, threw up a cloud of dust, and it probably hurt visibility a bit at that point. But after he kind of went off the track, he veered back to the center of the track. And at this point, visibility is a bit obscured by the dirt. And Pierre Levet is coming from behind, doesn't see and approaches really quickly Macklin's car, and his right front tire gets up on Macklin's left rear wheel. And one of these things about Formula cars and racing, if you know anything about tires and tires contacting each other, is a really, really bad thing. The amount of grip and adhesion that they have to one another just creates a situation where the cars basically crawl up on top of each other. Well, in this case, Levet's Mercedes launched off of the back of Macklin's Austin Healey like it was a ramp. Like he caught up on the tire and then got up on the back of the bodywork and launched up into the air. And the car, according to a spectator, flew as high as the top of an electric pole. So got some air behind it. Like we've seen these kind of crashes where like, how did that car fly that far? How is that even possible? But you consider the speeds involved. We're talking 150 miles an hour. Cars are to go pretty far, and especially if they're on a ramp, they're going to catch some air. And even making things worse, the pit straight that they were on was pretty narrow, and there was a slight kink in the track, which didn't look like much to spectators, but the drivers actually had to make an adjustment for this kink. And so as Pierre Levet's car flies off the back of Macklin's Austin Healey, it flies through the air and rolls over end for about 260 feet. And when this is happening, the car smashes into the embankment, right? That earthen and hay barrier that's on the side of the spectators' grandstands. It runs into that. The car disintegrates and explodes into pieces. And the momentum of the car going 150 mile an hour, the pieces of the car literally were whistling through the air like a bomb or a missile. They were traveling so quickly through the air that the spectators there reported hearing the whistle of these pieces flying through the air, which included the engine, which is still hot, the radiator, the front suspension work of the car, the hood of the car, the bodywork of the car. All of this stuff, after hitting the embankment, flew another well more than 300 feet into the crowd, into the stands. It's a horrific scene. This car crash that occurs, and then the pieces of burning, broken car fling into the stands, into the grandstands where all the spectators were, and there's no barrier between the racetrack and the spectators. Huge explosions are occurring. There's fire everywhere. People packed into this crowd were watching from ladders. They were watching from scaffolding to try to get a better view of the track. And they were more in the trajectory of these flying parts and rolled over pieces because they were high up in the air. Even further, the Mercedes design we talked about being high magnesium content. Magnesium burns really hot and really bright. And so because the car was made of this, it was literally spitting molten metal out of the fire from the car through this wreckage. And of course, Pierre Levet perished on impact of the car into the embankment, into the barrier, and the pieces of the car flew into the grandstands in such a way that it's so horrific to describe what occurred. the fire that spread from the car through these hay bales into the grandstands, just burned people alive in the grandstands. The hood of the 300 SLR flew off upon impact, sliced through the air like a guillotine, and is blamed for the decapitation and lethal injury of a large group of spectators. We're talking about people being beheaded by the hood of the Mercedes that went flying through the crowd. Reports from the scene, they described as people being mowed down, like the staggering loss of life by the parts of this car just flinging into the crowd, burning people alive, chopping them to pieces, literally pieces of bodies laying around. All the while, John Fitch, the American, is standing in pit lane getting ready to take over for Pierre Levet, who's coming into the pits to make a driver change. And he's standing there waiting for this to happen next to Mrs. Pierre Levet the whole time. Just a horrible scene. There's a movie that they made about this disaster, the 1955 Le Mans disaster. It was animated, and there's a quote from the team coach and Fitch looking at the fire burning down the track, and Fitch says to the coach, he says, "The fire, it's him," meaning Pierre Levet. It was a horrific scene. Over 80 people in the crowd were killed. 80 spectators who went to a race. Sure, on the back of their ticket it said printed, "Motorsport is dangerous. You attend this at your own risk." These people came out to a party. They came out to watch their heroes, these post-World War II daredevils out there fighting it out for who can have the fastest time in the 24-hour, this endurance race. Over 200 people were injured. Over 200 people were injured by this horrific accident. People were literally cut into pieces by the shrapnel and burned alive by this car that had caught fire and burned through the crowds. It was a horrible scene. People were literally screaming in the crowd. They were literally, this is so gross, they were literally picking bits of flesh off of themselves from the explosion that occurred and the bodies lying around them, people rushing to help each other. It had to seem like a scene right out of something that was unfortunately too recent and burned in the memories of the people who lived in Europe through World War II. You imagine your town being bombed, your city being bombed, and now you're reliving this thing at a motorsport race, at a fun thing, at an optional thing. It was terrible. People were rushing to help each other. Literally, people were being given the last rites in the crowd while this was all going on. And there were only 25 doctors available at the race, which at the time probably seemed like more than sufficient. 25 doctors at a huge race like this, but they were more than swamped in the more than 80 deaths that occurred. There's something I need to mention that blows my mind, and I think every single person who's ever heard this story just has to take a stop and pause and deep breath when they hear this. All of these things were going on. They kept the race going. Drivers kept driving. The officials did not stop the race. Later on, there was a bit of controversy and questions asked to why they didn't stop the race, given the horrific events that were occurring. There were different reports on why that was the case. Eventually, the official word became that the director cited that the fact that the roads would be too jammed with people trying to leave, such that emergency vehicles would not be able to get where they needed to evacuate on the roads. But this is a little controversial because, there wasn't a lot of consideration for what happened to those people before. So how much was there going to be after the fact? And then there was another quote from the race director, initially, right after the crash happened, where he said, "The rough law of sport dictates that the race shall go on." So there's a lot of controversy about why the race was continued, given the amount of catastrophe that was occurring all around. The drivers themselves really didn't have much of an idea what was happening other than some kind of crash and wreckage because, again, they didn't have any radios. There weren't big screens to watch while they were driving around the course. Mike Hawthorne was being waved into the pits because it was the pit window. But because of all the confusion and the danger, he was getting ready to stop but went another lap. So extended his driving an entire another lap of this long circuit before he came in with the other lead cars and realized what was going on. 13 minutes later, Dick Jacobs, driving the number 42 MG, lost control, leaving the section of track called Maison Blanche. He rolled and turned upside down and burned, but managed to survive, although severely injured, never raced again. This is after the initial thing that happened. Like 80 people were dead. The Mercedes crashed into the crowds. The race is still going on. 13 minutes later, another car rolls over and burns, but the guy is able to walk away from it. One of the other drivers in this race was Phil Hill, famous American driving. He was quoted by saying, "At this point, I was numbed by it all, shocked that this all could be happening at once. And on my first ever Ferrari racing lap of Le Mans, he had just gotten in the car after the driver change, his first time ever driving in a Ferrari at Le Mans, and this is what happened." And then he continued on, "But then Sterling Moss went by me like a streak in his Mercedes 300 SLR, and that woke me up. That was a lesson I never forgot, which was that when something happens, get on the gas."
It's kind of crazy to like talk about this scene in such a tragic day in motorsport, and then also looking into the mindsets of the drivers of the race went on, and here was this terrible thing that happened. Most of the drivers didn't know, especially if they're in the cars and you're on the other side of the track. You have no idea. You'll come across the pit straight and you'll just see fire and whatever. And it wasn't uncommon in this time of motorsports to see cars on the side of the road on fire. I mean, it's unlike nowadays whenever there's an accident, the race kind of slows down, full course caution, red flag, whatever it is, so that they can pick up these cars and get them out of the way. No. Whenever anything wrecked, it kind of got left there throughout the race. And so it wasn't uncommon to see this, but you're right, most of the people driving didn't know the level of the tragedy. And even some of the drivers that did and were kind of aware of it kind of were like, I guess I got a job to do. And the race goes on and we got to continue. And what blows my mind is that, from the Mercedes team, this is their number 2 car. Their number 1 car is still circulating. Sterling Moss and Fangio are still racing
That's right.
at this time. And how do you see this? How do you lose the life of your driver and the lives of so many in the stands and continue to focus on the other car and just be like, we need to continue? I'd like, that would be such a tough decision to make in that moment.
It speaks to the mindset of a racer, and a team lead, right? A crew chief who's racing this team on behalf of this factory, often in another country, right? Mercedes based over in Stuttgart. All those people who had worked on building those cars were all over there while this race was happening in France, and this was the representation for them. It was just such a important thing to them. And at the same time, their number 2 car was now gone. And what were they to do? Were they just going to stop and give up? I mean, they'd just gone through all of World War II, and here they are. They were once successful in 1952. They've come back, and they're trying to make their way, and there's all this horrible stuff going on. It's like they're back at war again, with fire burning all around them. The other thing you have to remember is that the circuit itself is over 8 miles long. So drivers would drive through this wreckage and see stuff going on, but then they were away from it for a little while. They weren't just like constantly seeing it like you'd imagine if it happened on a modern Formula One track or something like that. So they knew something was up, but they didn't have a lot of information. And that mindset of the racer, of Phil Hill, was, hey, something happened. Get on the gas. Get on it. Keep going. And obviously Mike Hawthorne and Fangio and Sterling Moss and all those guys were still out there circulating around the track, and they're still out there trying to race. So overnight, while these things are still being tended to, while the bodies are still being tended to, medical care is still being delivered, the race continues. And overnight, the Fangio and Moss car was leading by 2 laps at one point. During the night, John Fitch had strongly urged the team to retire. He was about to get in this car that Pierre Levay perished in. And he went to the team manager, Alfred Neubauer, and he made a really compelling case for the fact that it just is not going to look good. I mean, what is it going to be like if this car that represents the country of Germany, after what happened with World War II, they're going to go through this terrible catastrophe and they're going to get to the end of the race and celebrate a win? I mean, how bad will that look for us? That's going to make us, that's not a good look. We don't want to be there. So eventually, the Mercedes team manager, Neubauer, had agreed. But he didn't have the authority to make the decision. He had to answer back to Stuttgart, back to Mercedes-Benz headquarters. And apparently there was some back and forth for a period of time for Neubauer to convince headquarters that the right thing to do is to pull their cars out of the race and withdraw. So it wasn't until 8 hours after the crash. 8 hours went by of continued racing with dead people all around, with fire burning, with all this stuff, with the Mercedes number 2 car out of the race with their driver dead, and they were still continuing. But around 1:45 a.m., they got the approval from Stuttgart, and Mercedes-Benz decides to retire their cars while they were running first and third in the race overall. So the mindset of a racer was keep racing. They were out there still winning, but then they finally came around and agreed the right thing to do, the human thing to do, was to withdraw.
And it's interesting, too, because, I mean, Mercedes obviously had to make the tough decision, and how much effort and time was behind them going. And
Yes.
they even then approached their main competitors, Jaguar, and asked them if they would consider withdrawing as well, as kind of, hey, this isn't right. We need to take the consideration of the people that came here to be fans and spectators, that the situation has changed. And Jaguar didn't. And Mercedes, I believe, was the only team to withdraw their cars, pack up, and leave Le Mans.
Yeah, they made the active decision to do that, right? It wasn't like they DNF'd and were out. They said, look, we're winning, but we can't win. Not this way, not given these circumstances. We withdraw, we retire. And upon impressing upon the Jaguar team to do the same, they did not. They declined. So the race continued, and Mike Hawthorne in the Jaguar went on to his eventual first Le Mans victory. Obviously devastated by the tragedy, but he had won Le Mans. And again, back to that racer's mindset. All these things that happen, they happen. And what does a racer do when things go on? They get on the gas. And so he just cleared his head of what happened and drove to the end. And there were press photos of him celebrating. You know, he won the 24-hour Le Mans. That would be, in any other realm, a huge accomplishment to be celebrating and happy about. And in the winner's circle, had the bottle of champagne he was swigging from. And there was a picture that ran in one of the French newspapers with a picture of Mike Hawthorne drinking out a bottle of champagne in the winner's circle with his laurel wreath and the whole thing. And it had a sarcastic headline in French. It said, "Here's to you, Mr. Hawthorne, as the winner of the race, victorious and celebrating something at a time where celebration seemed not really appropriate."
And this was a huge tragedy. Like, to put it in perspective, I'm pretty sure up to this point it was the biggest death toll in motorsports, period, out of anything. And so the things that changed in motorsports were massive after this.
Yeah, there had been failures in safety such that individual drivers lost their lives. You know, we said before 1955, 7 drivers had died at Le Mans. But that was part of this undertaking. This is a thing for daredevils. These are people who are in airplanes doing combat, dogfights, right, to try to survive on behalf of their countries, fighting each other. Now they're out there on the racetrack, kind of perpetuating the same things, fighting it out there. It's hard to put your head around how important it was for the people who were involved for this thing and what it meant for them and how all these things occurred and how many innocent people who went just to go to the party, just to be in the presence of those drivers, of those teams, of that fanfare, to be there for the event and horrifically and tragically got swept up in what had occurred. It was a terrible day and one that should be remembered for a long time. You know, we run the 24-hour Le Mans every year and they continue to do that race. And I think it's something that we should all reflect back on is how bad it could be when we're out there enjoying ourselves, thinking about how good it could be when we're celebrating 24 hours of endurance racing and motorsport together.
So after this event, the French government immediately banned motorsports. The French F1 GP was canceled for that year. The French government was basically demanding that there'd be some sort of codes, regulations, safety implementation for motorsports to protect, drivers, but mainly the spectators, the people that would go there, that there would be some control, that something like this couldn't happen again. Switzerland completely banned motor racing in response to this, saw this tragedy happen and was like, yep, we don't want that in our country, not going to be a thing. And there was massive changes that came from this incident in regards to the racetrack at Le Mans, as well as in terms of racing in general. What sort of safety requirements were then required after this?
Yeah, there's before 1955 and after 1955. And there were massive changes that occurred as a result of this race, this tragedy, this set of circumstances that unfolded. And it cascaded to the history of motorsports in a way that we should be thankful for today, that there's been so many improvements and achievements in the realm of safety and in the realm of doing things to make both the drivers and the spectators safer to come out for a day of motorsports. Before that, it was just considered some kind of alternative, sort of almost countercultural kind of thing, and there was danger involved with it, and maybe that was part of the charm. We've learned to deal with these things a little differently today. There was a ceremony held at the Mercedes factory in 1955 where the team manager Neubauer and Moss and Kling and Fangio drivers, they symbolically covered one of the W196 cars with a white shroud. And it was like to say, this is over. We're not doing this again. And Mercedes-Benz did continue to participate in Formula One and sports car racing. And eventually, Sterling Moss did get his first Formula One championship driving a Mercedes-Benz.
Yeah, but in regards to Le Mans racing, they didn't come back for decades.
No.
It wasn't until 30 years later that they would come back, and not even in the terms of a factory-supported team, but as a motor supplier or an engine supplier for another team and with Sauber.
Yeah. It all went back from the French government announced new rules and that there would be a Le Mans in 1956. Of course, Mercedes did not participate in it. They made a lot of changes. They demolished the entirety of the grandstands and pits at the Circuit de la Sarthe. They straightened and widened the track at and near the pits. They realigned the Dunlop curve. They put in new pits that were 15 meters back from the track. They put more separation in between the road and the spectators, including a big ditch in between. They revised other stretches of the track and added some of those features we talked about before, right? Later on, the Porsche curves and the S's and so forth. Jaguar, shortly after this, shut down their works racing team before the end of the season. They didn't even get to the end of the Le Mans season after they won the 1955 24-hour Le Mans, and they got really bad press for that deal with Mike Hawthorne. They didn't race anymore that season. They also, Jaguar, didn't return for more than 30 years to Le Mans after that. John Fitch, the American driver, he retired from racing that same year and dedicated his life to safety in racing and motor cars. He developed safety devices, and he's famous for having created this thing called the Fitch barrel, which are those yellow sand-filled barrels that you see on the highway that prevent head-on collisions from being as bad as they are. John Fitch created that as a result of the horror he saw, the importance he realized of safety in road-going activities, not just racing, but even just driving out on the roads.
Yeah, it's pretty crazy of like this guy that was a racer and an opportunity to race for Mercedes at Le Mans and witnessed something horrific and decided to do something about it and improve safety not just for motorsports, but for public roads, for everyday driving, all of it, and took it very seriously. And there's a lot of implementation at racetracks and stuff like that can be attributed to him and his dedication to safety.
Yeah, and you think about how commonplace death was in motorsports until really recently, quite honestly. Back in these days, it was almost expected. It's such a different world than we have today where racing is really safe and it's very unusual for there to be injuries, let alone deaths of drivers or, heck, for spectators. We never hear about anything like that. Well, guess what? Later on, Lance Macklin, who had been kind of finger-pointed as the reason this thing happened for a lot of people, wound up suing Mike Hawthorne for libel. Kind of crazy because he felt like he was getting blamed for something that he felt like was
He's
not
receiving too much slander over the 1955 disaster.
Kind of crazy. So some people can't let things go or they focus on a different part of the problem. Mike Hawthorne went on to win the world championship in 1958. But later on, he died in an accident on the public roads. He was in a car and he tried to overtake another car. This is a year later. And the car he was trying to overtake was a Mercedes. Kind of creepy. Well, Mercedes didn't return, as you pointed out, to Le Mans until 1986, and it wasn't even a team entry, right? That was just being an engine supplier for the Sauber C8, the Kuros racing car for that team. And Mercedes supplied a 5-liter twin-turbo V8, cool engine, as sort of their dipping their toes back into the Le Mans waters after everything that had happened before.
Yeah, and so they participated with Sauber in 86 as well as 87, where they introduced the Sauber C9, which is a pretty famous race car nowadays. And I'd consider it a Mercedes, even though it's not a Mercedes. I mean, it had, the Mercedes star on the front fascia in some degree. That car actually had great success in the 1989 24 Hours of Le Mans, where they actually ended up winning overall. And in this trim, this C9 that participated in 1989, had an impressive top speed on the straightaways at Le Mans of almost 250 miles an hour. This was in qualifying trim. Obviously, they turned it up a little bit. So, yeah, Le Mans was getting safer, but still in those days didn't have the chicanes yet on the long straightaways, and we were still seeing these impressive high top speeds.
Yeah, once we're approaching 250 miles an hour, the race organizers realized we're going to have to make some more changes, and they added those 2 chicanes to the Mulsanne Straight in 1990, so the next year.
So there you go. There's the top speed record at the 24 Hours of Le Mans. And so once again, Mercedes was just teaming up with Sauber as kind of the engine supplier.
Yeah.
Arguably, it wasn't necessarily Mercedes participating. Maybe you can count this as half a win for Mercedes in the 1989 win at Le Mans. But it wasn't until 1998, so 89 to 98, 1998, where the factory effort actually returned back to Le Mans.
43 years after 1955.
Insane. Over 4 decades. And this gets us back to the GT1 era that we talked about. So 1998, that would have been the CLK GTR LM. And so when we talked about those 3 variants of the Mercedes GT1 cars, the GTR, the CLK GTR, that one never participated at the 24 Hours of Le Mans. In the 1997 season, they were just focused on GT1.
And if you missed it, go back and listen to the Flying Cars of GT1 class racing episode, because there's so much about these cars to learn, and we're only going to touch the surface of that here.
And so in 1998, that's when they developed the LM of the CLK GTR, which LM standing for Le Mans. They developed the car specifically to go back to the 24 Hours of Le Mans. They replaced the V12 that was in the CLK GTR with the more, quote-unquote, reliable V8 designed a little bit more for the endurance racing. Now, in 1998, they entered a handful of cars. Unfortunately, even though the car, the CLK LM, was dominant in the GT1 season and killed it overall, they both had engine failures during the 98 24 Hours of Le Mans. Neither of the Mercedes finished the race.
Yeah, it's one thing to qualify well, and we talk about cars that are on pole position through qualifying or whatever. Think about a race like the 24 Hour of Le Mans. How many changes can occur over a 24-hour period? It's not like you're at Monaco where whoever's in pole position is probably going to win because it's so hard to pass.
Right.
You have 24 hours of a lot of things going on, a lot of changes. So, yeah, the fact that they qualified well in first and third place, that was amazing, but they didn't get to the end of the race. And this is an endurance race. You have to get to the end. That's a big part of what teams need to do in terms of their preparation, not just to be fast, but to be able to be durable.
Yeah, and so the CLK LM, it qualified first and third for the race. And so Mercedes had this little bit of taste of they were going to be competitive, that they had good cars to potentially win the 24 Hours of Le Mans once again. And so they kind of went all in, pushed the chips all in to be like, all right, next year for the 99 season, let's make something specific to just absolutely dominate Le Mans. And that's when we got the CLR. And we talked about that story of the CLR, which in 1999 famously flew through the air.
And
not
it didn't,
once,
not twice.
not twice, 3 times it took off.
Yeah, the aero that they developed for this car, the overhangs on the front and the back, just the level of investment and engineering that went into this car created effectively a monstrosity. This thing that was able to catch air in parts of the track and flipped over in practice and qualifying sessions. Famously, Mark Webber flipped twice in the Mercedes CLR car in 1999. One time it was caught on video. It wasn't the time with Mark Webber. That was with Peter Dunbrecht's car that flipped actually during the race, is the one that everybody sees on video that goes off into the trees. So this is the point where Mercedes has pushed all their chips in. They're all into this thing again. It's been 44 years since the 1955 disaster. They have a good engine. They have what looks like a winning car. They weren't able to make it all the way there in 1998, so they pushed it all in for 1999, and the result was a car that was not stable at speed.
And once again, having a catastrophic failure at the 24 Hours of Le Mans. And so after 1999, with this failure, with the CLR, that they were so embarrassed that it was so dangerous and putting them once again in the headlines of Le Mans in a negative way as Mercedes, they disappeared once again for a couple decades before they went back to the Le Mans 24-hour as a factory effort. It took them until 2025, last year, to come back as a factory team, now in the GT3 category, not trying to go after the overall, but just be participant in the race itself. So let's circle back, because if we overarch and look at the timeline of Mercedes at Le Mans, this puts so much stuff into perspective, which is the first time they ever showed up was in 1930. Then they disappeared. Wars are going on. They have better things to focus on than building race cars, to be honest. Then they come back in 52, and they dominate.
Yeah.
Arguably, Mercedes' only overall win at Le Mans.
Yeah,
if we
right.
don't count the Sauber C9, which arguably isn't Mercedes.
That's right.
They have the success in 52. They take a break for 53, 54. They come back in 55. They have their massive disaster. They disappear from Le Mans completely until, the Sauber C9 happened in the 80s, whether or not you want to count that. But they only really returned in 1998. They had engine failures. They came back in 99, swung a little too hard again, embarrassed themselves, and then disappeared for another 25 years. One time that they got it right, and every other time things went terribly wrong. And so in 2025, there's nothing to report on 2025. Them and their GT3 cars, they didn't make headlines. So
yeah, they didn't enter any prototypes though, huh?
Exactly. And
Right.
now there's this whole conversation with everyone getting into GTP, hypercar, whatever you want to call it, right? Depends on if we're talking about IMSA or WEC. But with all these manufacturers getting into it, now McLaren has one, Genesis has one. Everyone's kind of looking at Mercedes of like, hey, you came back in 25 with your GT3, like, you going to make another prototype? And I could see why Mercedes would be reluctant to make a prototype to go after an overall win at Le Mans, given their track record, which this history is crazy.
Yeah, and their comeuppance has been felt multiple times, right? Where they've been dominant, they got a little arrogant, perhaps, and then these circumstances led them back to ground to go back to the drawing board for a while and figure out what they're going to do. And so it just makes you wonder. It's also a different era, and Mercedes has had such success in Formula One in the modern era, and as a road-going car and corporation, high visibility, high status, people think well of them. Is there some point at which they do forget their history and they say, I think we're going to go for this prototype entry into Le Mans again? Like, I wonder if they could get to that point, or are they going to say, like, look, we've learned from our history. What happened there was so horrific multiple times running. There's something here that we need to keep in mind. There's some lesson that we need to take away from it. Let's just focus our efforts elsewhere. I don't know. I don't know what the right thing to do is. Like, if I was Toto Wolff, if I was running the racing program over at Mercedes-Benz, how could I stay out of Le Mans? That's the world crown jewel of motorsport, right? We have this thing called the Triple Crown. It's winning the Indy 500 and the Grand Prix at Monaco and the 24 Hour of Le Mans. And only one person has ever done that, Graham Hill. This is one of those three most important races in the world. And Mercedes isn't even participating at the top level.
I just can't see like the aura, the souls of Le Mans like ever letting Mercedes win again at Le Mans. Like, are they just cursed to never succeed at Le Mans again?
It's hard to know. I mean, hell, just the memories of those 80 plus people who are dead because of what happened. Now, you can't blame Mercedes per se for all of that, but again, there's actions that lead to consequences, and things were handled maybe eventually okay, but for a period of time, maybe not so much. And that's sort of the lesson to learn about these things in history. Like, things might have been okay for a while, but maybe things were really bad for a while, and we want to remember that too.
Yeah, and I think that's an important note of saying that, like, in 1955, like, Mercedes didn't do anything wrong to cause that accident. In a way, it was a racing incident, and it was, that period of time and safety and where spectators were. It just kind of was the wrong formula to create a catastrophic event that then we needed to learn from and do something about. And thankfully, within motorsports, we've always made those changes. Whenever anything terrible happens in motorsports, there's always massive efforts to make things safer, whether that's the car, the safety equipment, for the spectators, the tracks, everything. And there's always that effort that's put forth. And even us talking about a country that banned motor racing because of this event in 1955, Switzerland, right? We talked about them. They didn't lift the ban in motor racing until this year, 2026.
Effectively this year. There have been some exhibition events and so forth, but it was May 7th, 2026, where Switzerland officially lifted the ban on circuit racing within their country. Since 1955. That's how much of an impact this thing made. And don't forget, Switzerland is right next door to France. They are right next to Germany, too. So them being the neutral party between those two, had a really interesting place to play politically through all this stuff that went on in World War II. So you can imagine that overhang and sort of on the Swiss mindset and culture. And like, they don't want to be a part of something that would create such a horrific outcome again. They tried to be at arm's length to it when it happened then, right? So yeah, you can understand it. And it's just one of those things where you have to ask yourself, why do we do this thing that we do, motorsports? We have this mindset toward competing with each other and winning, and sometimes winning at all costs, or cheating, or being innovative, coming up with ways to kind of skirt the rules or work around things. But sometimes everybody can be doing everything the right way, and it's not any overt neglect as much as it's an omission. It's forgetting to realize that cars have gotten so much faster and the safety of the racetrack needs to change as a result, or how we consider where the grandstands are and spectators are relative to the races that we watch. And I worry because there are still places in the world where stuff goes on like this, and they're special because they still go on, but they're perilous, right? The Paris-Dakar Rally, the Baja 1000, the Isle of Man TT. We see those spectators right up against the track, right in the line of where cars and bikes are going. And I would hate for anything like that to ever happen again. I hope in those cases they can preserve what's so magical about those kinds of racing, but still preserve human life.
Yeah, absolutely. No, it blows my mind that this event that happened so long ago, right? Like, we think about 1955, and it's like, it's ages ago. It's like well before we were born.
That's where they went, and Back to the Future.
Right. And for this to have a lasting effect where Switzerland just made their decision less than a week ago in modern era, like, that this had such a long-lasting effect and had such an impact on how everything shaped around motorsports and even just generic roadway safety. Like, we talked about the individual that was the co-driver of the person that unfortunately passed and went into the stands, and dedicated their life to safety features that we experience every day. Whenever you're on the highway and you see one of those big yellow barrels, that was because of the 1955 disaster at Le Mans.
Yeah, I mean, this is all fun to talk about motorsports and stuff, but it's real serious too, and we should remember the effect of the things that we're out there doing and wanting to do. And if nothing else, I think we could all take a minute to think about and remember the people who were all there at the race in 1955 and who died just out there to have a good time and watch this thing happen, or let alone those who are actually participating in the racing itself.
Well, this has been a fascinating reflection on Mercedes' very interesting relationship with Le Mans, and some highs and very low lows, and mostly lows, and kind of why Mercedes isn't really involved in the 24 Hours of Le Mans today.
Do you think they're going to go back? I kind of wonder. I don't know. I wonder about our listeners. What do you guys think? Is there a chance that Mercedes is going to come back to the highest levels of racing in 24-hour Le Mans again soon? Or are they going to take a pause on this and hang out in GT3 for a while so they can not relive this unfortunate part of their history?
It's a very interesting question. Only time will tell, and we'll see what happens this year at Le Mans. It's coming up for 2026, as well as next year if Mercedes has a new entrance.
Yeah. Hey, thanks for joining us. I know this was maybe a little bit more of a downer in terms of the topic compared to some of the things we talk about, but it's so important and such a fascinating part of motorsports history. We had to share it. We've been waiting to do this so we could do it right and explain it all to you in such a way that you could pick it up from here and go and learn more on your own.
Well, thanks, Todd.
Thanks, Alice. And thanks for listening. This has been Cold Start.